again. Oh, there we go. It is recording. There we go. And of course we have the annoying Zoom deal at the top. Okay, well, welcome to lesson 3 of ce3372, and this should be section 2. Actually, let me, while I have you waiting on me, I want to make one quick thing for section 1. Copy it to the other class. I wish they could tie these together, but for reasons they can't explain to me, oh, that's weird. Section 1, then we'll put it in okay, cool. So now we're all caught up. So last time the video failed for section 1, so the only one that was available for upload is section 2, and that's linked. Today's lesson is pretty straightforward. Can everybody hear me before I start babbling endlessly?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good. I have my video turned off so you don't get to see me. That's probably a good thing for you. Namely because I have a cat sleeping in the way of the camera. And here's lesson 3. So this lesson is aimed at the estimation of water demand for our, in this case, our distribution network. Many of the principles also apply to the estimation of capacity required for a sanitary sewer system, because a reasonable assumption is that the water that comes in to a network returns to the sanitary system. The stormwater capacity is estimated based on hydrologic principles, and so what's here doesn't necessarily apply to that. There are some links here to much of what I'm talking about is adapted from this chapter. In fact, you're actually going to see some of the graphics from that chapter. So that's available for reading, and I recommend it. Also recommend that you use the back button. A section of Chapter 290 of the Texas Administrative Code, specifically related at drinking water systems. Is here. And then some parts of the hydraulics and pipe networks from Werbs and James, USGS Circular 1200, which we will examine in a little bit more detail. And on to the lesson notes. So we'll look at part 1 and part 2. So broken into parts because the original intent was to pre-record this lesson. I couldn't find the pre-recorded ones, so this is the recording. So demand estimation, fall 2020 ce3372. We have to deal with water supply demands for various uses, and the kinds of uses of water are categorized as withdrawal, non-withdrawal, and consumptive. A withdrawal usage refers to water that's removed from a stream, lake, or aquifer to supply the users, and generally it's moved from that location to the users to satisfy the requirement. A non-withdrawal is like an in-stream type of use, and an example of that category would be water that's maintained in a reservoir for navigational purposes, to maintain the pool elevation. Yeah, there's nobody in the waiting room, so I have no idea what the passcode is. Anyway, the non-withdrawal is in-stream use for navigation, recreation, so the water can stay in the location to satisfy the requirement. So the example I have on the Tennessee Valley Authority system, they operate quite a few dams with locks to raise and lower boats, and they maintain pool elevations, and these pools are 20 and 30 miles long. So by maintaining that elevation of the pool surface, that 20 miles can be used to engage in commerce and carry barges up and down the streams. The last category of use is called consumptive use, and that's the fraction of water that's withdrawn from a source that's no longer available for further use. It's the water that gets incorporated into crops and animals, and by this we mean the actual biomass, and industrial processes such as heat exchange, where the water is taken from liquid to gas phase in order to absorb heat of the process, and conceivably the water that's contained in polyethylene bottles for making drinking water, in the sense that's consumed. That water eventually gets back, but it could spend quite a bit of time in those water bottles. So continuing, let's consider the water needs for a city. Now this is taken out of Gupta's book that I just showed you the link to, the chapter of interest. And in this context, imagine there's a river here that's going to be the source of the water. In this drawing, it's a river, but that could be a well field in an aquifer. It could be a large lake, like a Lake Tahoe or Lake Superior or Lake Erie or Lake Champlain or one of the other Great Lakes, and then one of the minor lakes such as Lake Inferior, which is just to the south of Superior. That was a terrible joke, so don't quote me on that. Here's a city that's represented by this large block right here. And it incorporates municipal and industrial requirements for that city. And in terms of fractions of use, the household uses is roughly 40% of this city's requirement. Commercial use 13%, small industries 30%, general public use, and there's a new one, and losses is 17%. So real systems, there's actually considerable water loss. A municipal system that loses less than 5%, in the business, the jargon's called unaccounted water. I think it's called unaccounted water. So values of less than 5% are pretty good. Everybody's happy. Once it gets around 10%, they actually hire companies, and those companies go out and find the unaccounted water. Because water that's unaccounted for or lost didn't go through a customer's meter. If it didn't go through a customer's meter, that means there's no revenue generated by that water. As such, it's lost its value, yet it was quite expensive to get the water to the city. So here they're calling public and losses uses 17%. This is just an example. That would be a big number if that was a loss number. 17% loss. I mean, that's pretty much 1/50 of water is not going through a meter, and you're not getting revenue for it. And then the industrial component, you have large industries, and then thermal power is categorized as a separate entity. And that's actually a fair categorization, because the thermal power industry, that's the industry that burns used dinosaurs and creates electricity. There's a fair amount of water that's used strictly for heat exchange. It turns out that used dinosaurs, when you burn them, get kind of hot, and they get too hot to make electricity unless you can cool the plant. So returning to this example, we have a portion of water that comes out of this stream, and in this case there's 35 cubic feet per second that's diverted and delivered to these 4 municipal use categories. And that water eventually goes through kidneys and colons and returns for sewage treatment and eventual return to the stream. You'll notice that it came in at 35, but we're only returning 30 cubic feet per second. So roughly 5 cubic feet per second over time in this diagram is lost forever. It's evaporated, or it leaves the system. We can't account for it. Our industrial facility is taking 70 cubic feet per second in, going through industry, industrial water treatment, and returning 63 of that. So 7 cubic feet per second is lost in industry. That's roughly 10% of the inflow. And in the thermal power industry, about 1% of it's evaporated in heat transfer, and the rest can be returned. So here's our generic urban area, and the flow diagram is indicating the relative inflows and outflows. I have these 3 circles labeled. These aren't in the original drawing, to indicate the 3 general sources. So in practice, large industries and certainly electric power industry, they pretty much get their own water. They don't. There's no expectation that a municipal water supply is going to produce and deliver water to large industry or to electric power industry. They're generally get their own water, and they do that for 2 reasons. One, they have very large quantities of water involved that could potentially overwhelm the municipal system in terms of actual capacity. And secondly, they have particular water quality requirements for their processes. So the water that goes into an electric power plant is substantially treated before it gets into the plant. There's quite a few additive packages to control scale and some other boiler-related issues. And it has to be treated again to be released back into the environment. And so they tend to recycle a lot of water internally. They only do new makeup water and release treated water when they have to. The same sentiment is true for the larger industries. They tend to recycle as much water internally as they can because they've spent money to treat the water to a particular quality level to meet their industrial needs. As an interesting example of that, the semiconductor fabrication industry requires water that's extremely pure. You can't have impurities in it. And so they don't necessarily source their own water by themselves, but they'll take their water supply, so it could be municipal water, for instance, and they'll treat it even further to produce the ultra-pure water that they need for their processes. So if we look at the municipal requirement, in theory that's quite simple. The simple relation that the volume required is equal to the how many people, the population, multiplied by the volume per person used. I have it written here as V over P. So if every person uses 100 gallons of water in one day, and there's 1,000 people, then we need 100,000 gallons of water per per day on average to satisfy that requirement. So that's fairly straightforward in demands that we know how many people there are and we know the usage per person. So the how many people brings us into the realm of a topic called population forecasting. And here we'll just touch on it briefly. It's a fairly important component of demand estimation, at least for a new system. So for short-term forecasting, we have three distinct growth phases as indicated by this graphic. So on the horizontal axis is time in years, and on the vertical axis is population. You can think of that as a count. So those are technically integers. In the initial growth phase, it's geometric growth, which says that the change of population with respect to time is proportional to how many people there are. So that's the early part of a growth phase. And then as population gets to a certain size, there's portions where the arithmetic growth phase is appropriate. And it says the change in population is proportional to some constant. Here the constant is 1. And then the declining rate of growth phase, as we reach a level called saturation population, is the change in population with time is proportional to the saturation value minus the current population. So saturation populations in terms of a municipal context would be that the city can't expand anymore geographically, and the housing density is as big as it can be. So there's not a lot of cities in the world that are close to saturation population. I could speculate that the Mexico City in the volcano basin that it's located in is an example of an area that would be geographically constrained and the population can't get bigger than some asymptotic value. I don't know what that value is. The same could be true probably for the Edo region around Tokyo and a few other places, but generally human habitation seems to be able to grow without bound. But Detroit's probably at its saturated population, but not for any reason. I was making a smart aleck comment on Detroit. The arithmetic involved in these phases is identical to the substrate limited growth that you learned in your environmental engineering class. And so we'll look at each one of these growth phases in turn and see what effect it might have. So when it's in the exponential phase, the growth model is the population at time 2 is equal to the population at time 1 multiplied by e raised to the potential growth constant in case of p times the time differences between 2 and 1. So for instance, if the growth rate is 3% and the time change is 20 years, at a rate of growth of 3% per year, a 20-year period is almost a doubling. So e to the 20 to the 0.03, that term is a 2. So after 20 years at 3%, you'd expect population to be double what it was at P1. So if P1 was 100,000, P2 would be 200,000. During the arithmetic growth phase is when the curve is in a roughly straight line. In that case, the arithmetic is the population at time 2 is equal to the population at time 1 multiplied by the slope of the growth curve, k sub a in this case, multiplied by the time difference between the two. And then the declining growth, the mathematics is shown here. So P saturation minus P1 represents the distance in population terms between the most that it can be and whatever the current population is. and that's multiplied by the quantity 1 minus e to the minus k sub d over t2 minus t1, and that gives us the new prediction. So what will happen here, population 2 can conceivably be bigger than population 1, at least as written here it will be, but it won't be doubling anymore. It might be, 0.1% bigger, 0.5% bigger, and so on as it approaches its saturation value. So, naturally, none of those constants are conveniently tabulated. And in general, historical data are used for both short-term forecasts and actually for long-term forecasts. So the United States Census Bureau makes estimates of census values between every decadal census. So currently we're in a decadal census. So 2020 is a census year, and so by statute, the United States Census Bureau needs to count everybody in the United States. Now, as far as I know, they don't do that by going door to door, breaking the doors down, counting everybody in the domicile, putting purple dye on and moving to the next house, because you'd run out of census workers real quick doing that. But they come close to that. So every known address receives mailing, and then they do follow-up on the manual door-to-door visit. And I think in the decadal census, they can get a pretty good count of actual people, and then they have some fairly elaborate population models that are used to extend that count and then make the declared United States Census count for 2020. For 2021, the Census Bureau will use a model and make estimates of the values by community, so by city or by zip code, for the intervening years until 2030, when there's a formal national census again. So if a region's been around for a while, then such a forecasting plot might be quite straightforward to construct. And then longer term predictions add something called a ratio and correlation technique to making population projections. Bear in mind, we're still doing this just to figure out how big to build our pipes. So one method that's attractive is called comparison forecasting, and this is used a lot. Geographically similar areas are used, and projections are made by comparing the growth curves to the area of interest. Now, the main uncertainty is that the area of interest might not progress similarly to the growth of comparison areas. So, for instance, see, Lubbock is 500,000 people, ish, and so that's the size that Houston was almost 40 years ago. So one could compare Houston growth to Lubbock growth and think that, okay, so Lubbock will behave the same way as Houston. Well, there's no real reason to believe that's true. I mean, Houston's economy was based on shipping and the headquartering of the energy industry. Well, Lubbock, to a lesser extent, has elements of that. I mean, it is a transportation hub, but it doesn't have a major headquartering of an oil industry, and it doesn't have a port which gives it access to the world for shipping. So thinking the two would grow the same may not be a good bet. Nevertheless, we can find other communities throughout the country that were about the same size as Lubbock and have similar economic characteristics in terms of shipping and industry, and use that to make projections. So here we have City A. This is the city we want to project. And the way this is done is they have the growth curve for City A up into its last census, and that identifies a population value. And then we look at similar cities, or what we think are similar. So here we have City B, follows that growth curve. City C is that one. and then city D is this one. And these are growing at different rates in different years. So at that point, the values here are cut and just shifted over to this location. And so one projection of city A is that it will follow city C behavior, and this dashed line is its future behavior. The other one would be it follows B, and there's the future behavior of B. A third is D prime, and then an averaging can be used to produce the A prime curve. So we can average the three similar areas and use that as our population projection. The ratio or the transposition method is based on the ratio of the observed populations of two study areas. And so this is pretty obvious. The area of interest is multiplied by a transposition ratio. So PO would be a comparison area, and P sub O prime is the study area of interest. And so we take the current population and then multiply by this ratio between the two areas to get a new population. Another method is correlation. So just perform ordinary least squares on the populations or log population, generate a predictive equation based on the reference population, and then simply put the current prediction value in to get a new value. The last and most complicated method is called component forecasting. And in this case is when we build a formal model of population that considers birth rate, death rate, net migration rate over a forecasting interval. And this seemingly simple expression, birth, death, migration, is actually a non-trivial modeling activity. And pretty unlikely engineers would ever do this. But it's nice to know of its existence. If you're really interested in population modeling, this is a really nice book from the 1980s by James Frauenthal. The only reason I know of it is I worked for him in the 1980s. And I didn't help write this book. I helped him do some other stuff. Real simple. And so that's how we estimate a population in the future. And so the reason we have to worry about that for the future is if we examine the Texas Administrative Code, I hope I can find this. Oh, it didn't do. I wanted to search the document. Go here. Let's see. Is it? There we go. Doesn't have their nothing's working. Somewhere in here it has, there we go. Present and estimated future maximum quantity demands. And elsewhere in here it states what the future is, which is 50 years is the implied future. So you need to be able to estimate population, consequently estimate demand out into the future. That's the whole point of doing that. And so we've seen some methods. By far, comparison forecasting is certainly defendable for engineers to use, and perhaps some ratio method. Getting into formal growth modeling is non-trivial work. But you're all capable of it. I mean, the arithmetic is not that hard. So the forecasting, its purpose in life is to help establish the population that's to be served. And then we use those per person needs to make further estimates and demand estimation. So some of the components that matter are the average daily demand by user category, hourly variations, and fire demand. The design life varies by system component or by statute, and then maintenance and replacement needs have to be planned for components that will fail. And so here's a picture of a couple of different water systems. So moving from right to left, on the right side, the upper one is a distribution system, lower one's a distribution system. They look the same. That's intentional. Then the upper system has a service reservoir, so that's where water is temporarily stored to be sure that there's sufficient volume to service the system on a day-to-day basis. That receives its water from a treatment plant. The treatment plant obtains its raw water from, in this drawing, a river and a well field. So this particular community has two sources of water. And notice the river source is a dashed line, so it's likely in this drawing that they prefer the yummy well water to the river water because it's got like fishes and stuff in it. It gets in the pumps and it makes fishy flavored water. So they want the well field water if they can. But they have this alternate supply. The lower picture is a little different layout. It draws its water from a reservoir through a single conduit to a treatment plant into the service reservoir and then straight to the distribution system. So those systems initially look quite similar, but they're fundamentally different. In the case of the upper one, the well field could fail and they still have a water supply. Whereas in the lower one, if that conveyance conduit fails, well, I guess that's true for the upper one, then they have some real trouble. And so knowing these different potential points of failure are important in order to plan the maintenance activities. So here's a table from Gupta's book showing listing the different types of major structures, like in the previous drawing, and an expected design or service period. And so the river hopefully is indefinite. It stays there for a long, long time. And the capacity, we would make design based on the maximum daily requirement drawing from the river. If it's a well field, maximum daily. If it's a reservoir, he suggests that we can get by with average annual demand. And then the design life for the different things, the well field would be a 10 to 25 year service life, and the reservoir 25 to 50 year service life. And what those lifetimes mean is, we have to project what the population will be at the end of that lifetime so that we can make the initial design big enough to accommodate that population, as well as plan for maintenance activities to keep it up and running. And then the conveyance are based on maximum daily capacities, and from as far out as from beginning to 25 years out up to 50 years out. The pumps have service lives of 10 years, and so that could be used to design and stipulate their capacity. So conceivably, you could start with a small pump, knowing that in 10 years you have to replace it anyway, and then you would move to a bigger pump. I'm not sure if that actually ever really happens, but that's what's implied by this diagram. Treatment plant has about a 10 or 15 year service life. That seems low to me. I imagine real treatment plants are quite a bit larger. And then the service reservoir, 20 to 25 year service life, and it would be based on its working storage requirement from hourly demand plus the fire demand storage. And our distribution system, those have service lives by part from 25 to 50 years. And in Texas, you're doing them for 50 years. And you want to choose the greater of the maximum daily plus fire demand or the maximum hourly requirement, because you want those pipes to be big enough to do their job. And then the distribution grid, you size that based on full build out. So you don't know when that is, but that's how it's planned. So the average daily use certainly varies by category. Residential, commercial, or industrial are depicted here. So residential is water that's used for drinking, landscape, swimming, fire, street cleaning, etc. And there are usually 2 demand peaks per day, a morning and an evening peak. Commercial are things like motels, hotels, holiday inns, offices, and shopping centers. And usually the peak demand is less, and the variability is less than residential demand. And then industrial is water for fabrication, cooling, petroleum refining, and the water use depends on type of industry, and many industries source their own water. So again, the use type is going to have an impact on what the demand calculations come up with, especially this particular apartment right here, where you go to the top floor and then you crawl into Dragon's Mouth and you get to take this water slide all the way down to the street. It's a little bit hard on clothing, so when you get to work you're still dripping wet, but it's a quick way to get down the apartment. So one way of estimating daily usage is to find some authoritative sources, and one of them is the USGS Circular 1200. And what this has is estimated water use in the United States. It's organized by state, and then it's also organized by category. But you notice one thing kind of glaring at it. Look at the date. So it's 1995. So arguably, let's see, 95, 2000, 25 years old. If I'm doing my arithmetic, yeah, 25 years old. So there's a reasonable concern that it's certainly not current. Let's go take a look at what it looks like. Because it is the best authoritative thing we have for getting information in a hurry. So I'm scrolling down through the reading, writing, arithmetic part. Has a nice discussion on different types of water uses. Has maps by region. So you notice these regions in here have actually pretty low withdrawal, because that's the flippin' desert and doesn't have any water to withdraw anyway. And this must be some sort of northern kind of desert. And then we got the east coast and the left coast, which uses up a fair amount of water, and then the Missouri River Basin in the north central United States has large water withdrawals. And then there's tables like that, and actually I wanted to get to something like this. So this has a bunch of tables of different categories, so you would have to poke through and find the one that makes the most sense for your need. But here's total water withdrawals by use category and state for 95. And if we were to pick Texas, for instance, there's 3,290 million gallons per day that's withdrawn in Texas for municipal or for public water supply. Of that, 130 million gallons per day is fresh water, is domestic, and then the various breakdowns are listed here. Notice that the thermoelectric use uses 9,590 million gallons per day, which, interesting, is can't possibly be part of that 3,290. So that's what I meant by certain industries source their own water. Moving further down, I think it has a little bit more refined. Public water supply by state freshwater. So here's Texas again, and there's nothing special about Texas except it begins with the letter T and ends with the letter S. And no other state does that and has an EXA in the middle. It's just a state. And actually it's a big state, so it has that benefit. There's our Texas water usage by some different categories. The source water, ground or surface, how many people are served in thousands. So this table would certainly have to change if it was to be brought forward to 2020. So that's circular 1200. This would be pretty good for approximating in the case where you could take those tables and produce a gallons per person usage figure. Because even though it's 95, that number, if anything, has gone down with water conservation practices that we have now compared to 95 practices. So if in 95 it was 250 gallons per person per day, that's a pretty good estimate of an upper bound of use. It'd be useful for per connection calculations. So here's table 4. We've already seen that when we did it live, and I stipulate that it's got maps and tables, and it's a useful gross estimation tool. The second tool would be to look at one of the online readings, Water Distribution Systems, out of the Land Development Handbook. And it has tables that look like the following. It has use categories: household, commercial, industrial, public, and loss, and then gallons per capita per day. So that's how many gallons per person per day is used. So in their table, 60 gallons a day for household use, 20 for commercial, 45 for industrial, and so on. That's clearly a pretty crude estimate table. Another way you can make an estimate would be to estimate it from a plumber's perspective, which is how much water can you actually get into a facility. And so if we're looking for a typical meter to a house, I mean, the most you can get per house is about 80 gallons a minute into a 2-inch copper pipe. And so that gives us another way to estimate it if we can count the number of houses in the area that we're going to serve. And that's actually a fairly realistic count. If we're doing new development, we can probably make a decent estimate of what kinds of structures are going to go there. And then we can look at the various local water codes to find out what the minimum pipe sizes are, and use that minimum pipe size in a table like this to estimate the flow rate per structure. That's the most that we could conceivably get into the structure. What this table doesn't have is what the working pressure is. So I'm going to assume they mean at 35 pounds per square inch. And you can go a little bit crazier. You can look at the per connection estimate and look at this chart to figure out how many gallons per minute each device requires. Add all of them up together, and that's the peak flow rate that you would need for that particular house. So for every faucet, every toilet, every bathtub, every shower, every dishwasher, every washing machine, it's like when I had my nephew and his fiance living with me. None of these estimates take into account of having young people living with you. They just turn everything on and leave it on. So it actually is conceivable that all those things could be turned on at once. Fairly unlikely, but conceivable. That would give us a peak flow rate. And then we could assume that they only run for 10 minutes, and that would be take that volume and then divide by the 10 minutes. That's a service flow rate. Another way of estimating is there's a document from the 90s, the Private Water Systems Handbook out of Penn State University, which has this table and several other tables, which are minimum flow rates for homes based on bedrooms and bathrooms. And so if you have a 6-bedroom, 3-bath home, the least you can expect it to use is 18 gallons per minute. And our RG195 publication has a per connection table for specific things, such as schools where you can't get food, can't get exercise, and can't get bathed, is 18 gallons per person per day. But if you have a school where they feed you and you can go get exercise at the gymnasium and then shower after you're all sweaty, uses 30 gallons per person per day. My favorite here is youth camps with flush toilets, showers, and dining halls is 42 gallons per day. But youth camps without flush toilets, showers, or dining halls. So that was the youth camp I went to. It was called camping. Don't use much per person per day at all. And so on. Another feature of demand estimation is the timing. So I've taken this graphic is from, I think it's from Metcalf and Eddy. It's from another book that has time of day and then a daily usage in gallons per capita per day, starting at midnight and going back to midnight. And what this reflects is, from midnight to 4 a.m., the water usage in the community is declining. And then around 4 a.m., shift change occurs and everybody starts to wake up, make coffee, take a shower, and so we get this morning peak. In this particular diagram, it's about 7 a.m. Then it declines a little bit more, but the net usage is up compared to 4 a.m. And then we get the evening peak as everybody goes home from work and then tries to wash the day off themselves. And then it declines in the evening back down to the midnight level and then repeats itself. And so this is used for time variation within a day. The average estimates are useful for long duration, multiple years of usage. And then the within a day, we need a chart like this. And use also changes with season, which days of the week, and any special events. So at halftime in the Super Bowl, there's, in the water industry, the big flush, which is a real thing. And in the larger communities, during Super Bowl Sunday, at the halftime, there's usually a pretty dramatic drop in water pressure. It's only for a few minutes. I had the fortune many years ago of being in the control center at the city of Houston. So their water control center is a place called 105 Sabine. That's just the name of a building. And it's pretty old school, so you all would kind of laugh at it. So they had this big board, which was one wall of the control room, and it had a skeletonized map of the city of Houston. And on it had some pipelines, and there were little lights in it. And the lights would be amber, green, or red, depending on what the water pressure was at that location. So kind of like that EPA net diagram I showed you earlier, but a whole lot less detailed. It was manually wired in. It was a different era. And when the halftime occurred at the Super Bowl, you could watch those lights go from green to amber to red, and it just propagated out of the city from the water treatment plants. It didn't stay red for very long. It came back to amber in about 10 minutes. But it was really fascinating. That big flush uses a lot of water over a short period of time. We have to at least acknowledge that exists and account for that in our designs. So one way for dealing with usage variation within a day is this rule of thumb. This is adapted from Gupta's textbook. It says that the percent usage, and this is percent of average, is 180% divided by the time unit in days raised to the 0.1 power. And this is intended for use over a time frame from 1 hour up to 365 days. And it's the ratio relative to a single day. Fire demand is another consideration. We mentioned it last meeting. And in the fire demand, the fire usage on an annual basis should be negligible. I mean, we don't want our cities burning down from time to time. Maybe with the recent protesting and burning of buildings in cities, this slide may not be relevant, but that's not going to last forever. So in general, we don't want cities to burn. We don't want our communities to burn. So in theory, we should never have an actual or a manifested fire usage demand. But when we need water for firefighting, the rate of withdrawal is very, very high. We need it now, and we need a lot. And so generally, we design and build the systems to satisfy fire demand. And in doing that, our service reservoirs will have substantial excess capacity whose sole purpose in life is to provide enough volume for fire flow demand. The demand estimation of flow rates is kind of an art. In certain places, it's by statute. So the Houston Infrastructure Design Manual, I believe San Marcos, and a few of those other ones that I have linked in the prior lessons, just explicitly stipulates a fire hydrant shall deliver 2,000 gallons per minute. Fire hydrants shall be located every 500 feet. They've saved us the otherwise difficult estimation process. If we have to make that process, there's a couple of formulas from the Insurance Service Office, which is kind of like an international insurance trade group that publishes guidance documents, among other things. And so the fire flow in gallons per minute could be estimated by this formula here, which is 1,020 multiplied by the square root of population in thousands, multiplied by 1 minus 0.01 times the square root of population in thousands, to come up with a fire flow in gallons per minute. And the source of the 1020 and the 0.01 is from the ISO's either real or data studies. Industrial demand has its own, like I said, sources its own water. But if the community supply is going to supply the industry, so if we're designing a system that is going to supply water to an industry in addition to our drinking water distribution system, or if we're doing it specifically for industry anyway, then depending on the industry, that will help establish the kind of water supply we have to provide. So for example, this table has a few industries listed and the average water usage for that industry by some unit of whatever product they make. So for example, a thermal power plant, at least at the time of the data that is expressed in this table, which is 20 years old, so actually that's a thermodynamic thing. I can't imagine it's changed much. We're going to require 80 gallons of water per every kilowatt hour produced, and that's mostly cooling water. So we have to be able to have enough water to be able to heat transfer that, and then a small fraction of that, probably 10%, has to be evaporated to take the waste heat away. Producing steel, we would expect to use 35,000 gallons per ton of steel. So your car, you have a car that's made out of steel. Mine is mostly steel with a fair amount of plastic in it. Weighs 2 tons. So my car has 70,000 gallons of water were used in its manufacture. Excuse me, the manufacture of the steel that it's made out of. Paper production, 50,000 gallons per ton of paper produced. Textiles, 140,000 gallons per ton of textiles produced. So T-shirts are a terrible water user, making 140,000 gallons per ton of T-shirts. Making Coke, which is an allotrope of carbon that's used industrially, not Coke the soda pop or Coke the intoxicant, both of which both use water, by the way. About 3,600 gallons per ton of carbon produced. And petroleum refinery, 770 gallons per barrel of oil is produced. And that I think is misleading, because crude oil comes out of the ground mostly as water. So if it's, if the water cut or the oil cuts like 5 or 6% by volume of produced water, you can still get economically useful oil out of that. And then once there's not enough oil cut, the water is then not useful for oil production, but it's got to be used for something else. So petroleum, that's petroleum refinery. Okay, I take that back. Refining, 770 gallons per barrel. And then another demand that we are quite aware of, but we often forget, is the waste assimilation demand. So treated or even untreated wastewater, when it's discharged back into the environment, exerts a demand on the environment for assimilative capacity. And we need to estimate the volume involved for doing that. There's a lot of methods employed for doing waste assimilation demand. One's total maximum daily load, which is an elaborate modeling and calculation process to figure out how much wastewater can be returned to a particular receiving stream or reservoir. Dissolved oxygen SAG and older modeling technology do the same thing, and similar approaches. We can make a fairly good initial estimate by using the formula that's presented here, that lowercase s represents the receiving stream, and the lowercase and the W represents the waste stream. So the waste discharge flow rate is equal to the receiving stream discharge flow rate divided by 40 minus 0.38 multiplied by percent treatment. So roughly, we need 40 times the flow, 40 units of receiving stream flow for every 1 unit of waste stream flow, and that's if the waste is treated at 100% treatment. And then as the treatment level of the waste is reduced, we'll need more stream flow availability. Last one is irrigation, and that's outside the scope of this course. But in irrigation uses, there's several components of what irrigation water goes to. One is making biomass, which is how much water gets bound up in the actual crop, and that is certainly important. Another one is evapotranspiration, how much of the water is consumed and then evaporated as we're making that biomass. There are farm losses, or losses of water on the various farm and ranching activity, and then conveyance losses, the losses that occur bringing the water to or from the agricultural user. Some other demands to consider are hydropower, and that changes whether it's a run-of-river or a storage release system, and then navigation demands. I mentioned that earlier, that navigation is a in-stream user of water, and it depends on how a system is operated. If we're using lock and dam, for example, every time there's a transit of the locks, there's a certain volume of water that's lost to that system. Panama Canal being a good example. So the Panama Canal can carry a lot of ship traffic, and does. but it can't be operated indefinitely. So if they filled the locks and lowered them repeatedly, Lake Gaitoon would run empty. There's not enough inflow to sustain it. So there has to be some operational care and awareness of that demand. And there certainly is. I mean, it's not operated enough in regular times to present a concern. But I imagine during drought periods, the number of raisings and lowerings of ships are of great concern to the operators of the canal. And that, I believe, is my discussion on water demand. I feel like I'm missing something, but I don't remember what. Claims there's a population projection spreadsheet. I will risk opening it on video, see what happens. So it has different growth models. Here, I think you could, if you were to look at that chapter from Gupta that there's a copy of, this would give you the ability to follow along some of the examples in that. And cat, I need that mouse. There we go. There's no supplemental data in this lesson. And that completes it for the day. So today's lesson was largely me just talking at you. I'll have these recordings rendered as soon as I can and posted and linked. And let's take a look at any outstanding or pending exercises. So we have aqueduct elevation maps. Oh, there was a question last time. While I have you all here, you can watch me do this, and then you'll know where it is. I'm going to go to home page. I need to give you various login credentials for things. Let's see if I can edit this thing. Looks like I can't. Okay, so this one has no login credentials. That's just a link. That's the password to that one. And then the there's the password for the mapping tool. So this I'm pretty sure is a password for the mapping tool. If I'm wrong, you can try to reverse them. By reverse, I mean put the TTU student in the user block and then put the ID 10T into the password block. Let me save that. See if it works and make sure the links still work. Sweet. Okay, cool. And with that, I will... Okay, so will part 3 of lecture 2 be posted? No, there is no part 3. What you might want to do if you look at the section 1 Lecture 2 video because that's the only one that I actually was able to capture and render. Is there a group me for the class? Just wanted to know. Stella, I don't know. Was there a quiz 1? Yes, there was. Let's see what the due date is, because all quiz 1 is a mostly to be sure that you can log into the. Okay, it doesn't look like there's one there. Maybe there wasn't. Oh, there must have been a quiz. There's no way I would do it without having a quiz. I'm the quiz king. I like quizzes. Oh, quiz collection. Let's see what the due date is. It's due on the 2nd, so you still have till tomorrow to do the quiz. There was a quiz 2 due on. Yeah. I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. No, there is no quiz 1. There was supposed to be, but that was for a different learning management system, and I didn't want to bother with carrying it over. So the quizzes start at 2. I'm sorry, that's confusing. Any other questions? Okay, well then I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and the call, and I will see you on Thursday. I think the automated invitation's working correctly for the Thursday meetings, and I apologize for the very last minute nature of this one. When I came to my computer, I thought I had already done all the automated stuff, and it failed. And I'll have to remember to try to fuss with that after I hang up. So thank you for your attention and patience and putting up with a difficult situation, this online learning stuff, and making the best of it. I know I did look at the server a few days ago and noticed that many of you already turned in your exercise 1, and that's good. That's a good thing. And so what that means to me is that the Blackboard is at least collecting your work. And I'll get around to grading that over the next few days. And so you can check from time to time to see if there's been any grades posted for the work you've turned in. And with that, I will end the call.